Chapter 14, The Brain and Cranial Nerves. The purpose of this chapter is to understand how the brain is organized, protected, and supplied with blood, compare and contrast the various areas of the brain and their functions, discuss the functional organization of the brain, and to learn about cranial nerve structure and function. The brain is the center for registering sensations, correlating these sensations with one another, and also with stored information, making decisions, and taking action. It is also the center for intellect, emotions, behavior, and memory. It also directs our behavior towards others. And in this chapter, we will consider the principal parts of the brain, how the brain is protected and nourished, and then how it relates to the spinal cord and the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So we'll start with the principal parts of the brain. The brain and the spinal cord will arise from embryological tissue called the ectoderm, beginning as a hollow neural tube. And then the major parts of the brain include the brain stem, the diencephalon, the cerebrum, and the cerebellum. The brainstem, diencephalon, cerebrum, cerebellum. Four major parts. Our brain is protected by the cranial bones and the cranial meninges and cerebrospinal fluid. Here you see the cranial bones and the cranial meninges. So the thin layer of parietal bone here from our section, and then the three layers of the cranial meninges, which are continuous with the spinal meninges that we talked about, and so thus are named the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. Three extensions of the dura mater will separate parts of the brain. Those are the falx cerebri, falx cerebelli, and tentorium cerebelli. Blood flows to the brain mainly via the blood vessels that branch from our arterial circle or the circle of Willis. That's located at the base of the brain, and then the veins that will return the blood from the head to the heart, we can also see. So we have blood flowing uh, back to or blood flows to the brain via the vertebral and the carotid arteries. And then it will flow back to the heart via our jugular veins, which are not pictured in this image. Although our brain is only about 2% of our total body weight, it utilizes about 20% of the oxygen of the entire body. The brain is one of the most metabolically active organs of the body, and the amount of oxygen it uses will vary with the degree of mental activity being performed. Any interruption of the oxygen supply to the brain can result in a weakening, permanent damage, or death of brain cells. If we interrupt the mother's blood supply to a child during childbirth before it can actually breathe, then this may result in paralysis, mental retardation, epilepsy, or death. The second point here, carbohydrate storage in the brain is limited. Therefore, our supply of glucose to the brain must be continuous. And so a glucose deficiency in the brain could produce a mental confusion, dizziness, convulsions, and unconsciousness. So this is often when you see people that have become hypoglycemic. They have that mental confusion, the dizziness, convulsions, and then unconscious if they're not if they don't have enough glucose. Our brain has a blood-brain barrier. This is going to protect the brain cells from harmful substances and pathogens by serving as a selective barrier to prevent the passage of many substances from the brain. And some of those substances could be good things, such as therapeutic drugs. So oftentimes we are not able to target brain tumors, say with chemotherapy, because of this blood-brain barrier. An injury to the brain also can cause the breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. So this injury could be a traumatic injury. It could be due to inflammation or toxins, and it can lead to the breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. And then that would allow the passage of things that are normally restricted into the blood, into the brain tissue. This is thought to be the mechanism of how HIV enters the brain when we get this breakdown in the blood-brain barrier. Next is cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is a clear and colorless liquid that also serves to protect the brain and the spinal cord against chemical and physical injuries, and it carries oxygen, glucose, and other needed chemicals from the blood to the neurons and the neuroglial cells. The cerebrospinal fluid, by carrying the oxygen, the glucose, and those other chemicals, it helps to maintain homeostasis. So we have 4 cerebrospinal filled cavities within the brain, and those are called ventricles. So here you can see the 4th ventricle, the lateral ventricles, and the 3rd ventricle. So altogether 4, because you have a lateral ventricle on each side, and then you have the 3rd ventricle, and finally the 4th ventricle. These ventricles will contain the actual cerebrospinal fluid. This cerebrospinal fluid is made in the choroid plexus. Cerebrospinal fluid, we said, is made or is formed by a filtration of networks of the capillaries in these choroid plexuses. And then it will circulate through the subarachnoid space, the ventricles, and the central canal. Materials that enter the cerebrospinal fluid from the choroid capillaries cannot actually leak between the surrounding ependymal cells, and so these constitute the blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier, permitting certain substances to enter the fluid but excluding others, and thereby protecting the brain and the spinal cord from harmful elements. Most of this fluid will be absorbed by the arachnoid villi of the superior sagittal blood spinous. And this absorption normally will occur at the same rate at which the cerebrospinal fluid is produced in the choroid plexuses. So by them occurring at relatively the same rate, we are able to maintain somewhat constant volume and pressure of the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, if we cannot circulate or drain the cerebrospinal fluid properly due to an obstruction in the ventricles or the subarachnoid space, then we develop what we call hydrocephalus. Hydro meaning fluid or water, and cephalus because it is dealing with the brain. This fluid buildup that occurs will cause increased pressure on the brain, either internally or externally, depending on where the blockage is going on. and then surgically draining the ventricles and diverting the flow of the cerebral spinal fluid by an implanted shunt can positively and dramatically affect the individual's prognosis in that case. Here's another image showing you your ventricles, your choroid plexus, and the aqueduct draining the fourth ventricle, and then the third ventricle first, the aqueduct, and then draining down into the fourth ventricle. So, lateral ventricle on either side of the hemispheres of the brain, the choroid plexus in between, creating the cerebrospinal fluid. It then will move to the third ventricle, make its way down the aqueduct of the midbrain, and then into the fourth ventricle through the median aperture and continue on down your spinal cord. We will pause here